Good day and welcome to our lecture on nonverbal communication. In this lecture we will be covering some of the basics about understanding nonverbal communication by first going over what it is, the different categories, and a couple of ways to improve your skills using nonverbal communication. Understanding nonverbals is important to both the speaker and the audience, as both parties will be communicating in this manner during a presentation. Many people are not aware of the way the nonverbal cues come off when they are communicating. So this lecture is focused on helping you understand how to recognize your own nonverbal communication habits, and also how to recognize them in others. So let us first begin with a basic understanding of what nonverbal communication is. The general definition is the use of communication based on the person's use of their body. It entails most physical communication outside the verbal context and is focused on the observation of body motions. It is important to understand that nonverbal communication is bound by our culture. What nonverbals communicate in one culture may communicate something different in another culture. For the purpose of simplicity, we are going to approach nonverbal communication through our own culture. Nonverbal communication therefore serves 6 main functions. First, it functions as a means of complementing, which is the practice of combining one's verbal communication with their nonverbals to complement or emphasize meaning. For example, when giving a presentation, many people tend to use basic hand gestures which seem to flow with the presentation of their speech. The hand gestures themselves do not really stand for any particular thing, but they complement what is being said by going with the flow of the presenter. The second function is contradicting. This is observed when your nonverbals contradict your verbal message. This can be done both on purpose or by accident. For example, you may state that you are not nervous, yet still portray forms of nervousness by way of your nonverbal cues. Or perhaps if someone desires to be humorous and display a form of sarcasm, they may say one thing while obviously indicating the opposite through their body language, making it obvious in order to display their sarcasm. The third function is what we call accenting. This is the use of nonverbals as a means to emphasize a portion of the verbal message, usually by pairing a word and gesture together. For example, yelling the word "no" while slamming your hand on the table. Next is what is known as repeating. This is the use of nonverbals repeating the actual verbal message. The most notable example would be shaking your head up and down while saying "yes," or by shaking your head back and forth while saying "no." The fifth function is regulating. This is the observance of feedback from another in order to maintain the flow of a message. This can be seen when a speaker reacts or adjusts their message when they observe the nonverbal feedback of the audience. And lastly, we have substituting, which is the function of using nonverbal cues to replace the verbal message, usually by the use of emblems. For example, instead of verbally saying "hello," you would substitute it by waving your hand. Now that we have covered a basic understanding of nonverbal communications as well as the main functions, let us begin to explain the main categories on nonverbal communication. The first category we will begin with is called haptics. This is the study of communication by touch. We tend to use haptics as a means of communication on a daily basis. For example, when we greet people, show affection, display accomplishments, or when we try to control a situation. The understanding of touch and what it communicates is often perceived by 3 factors: duration, frequency, and intensity. By duration we mean the length of time the touch is implemented. By frequency we mean how often touch happens. And by intensity we mean the amount of pressure applied. These different factors influence the perception of communicating through touch. Our next category is known as kinesics. This is communication through facial expressions, eye behavior, and gestures. First, let's observe facial expressions. Facial expressions tend to communicate our emotional states, and often are portrayed in what is known as sadfish. Sadfish is an acronym for the 7 main emotions which facial expressions communicate. They are surprise, anger, disgust, fear, interest, sadness, and happiness. Second, we have communication through eye behavior, also known as oculesics. The main thing we observe when communicating through eye behavior is the type of gazing and the amount of time it is done. The timing affects the meaning and the interpretation of eye behavior. For example, looking down or away may communicate nervousness, while staring at someone from a distance may communicate romantic interest. The third characteristic of kinesics are gestures, which is the use of hand movements and emblems to illustrate messages. The next category of nonverbal communication is vocalics. It is important to understand that vocalics and verbal are not the same thing. When we refer to verbal communication, we are specifically referring to the actual words and message in the communication process. However, when we refer to vocalics, we are referring to the use of vocals which influence the verbal message. Vocalics has the largest number of characteristics in regard to nonverbal communication, because it covers volume, pitch, rate, pauses, vocal variety, pronunciation, articulation, and vocal quality. We do not have the time here to go through each of these in detail, so I will give a brief explanation for each of these elements of vocalics. First, volume simply refers to the loudness or softness of your voice. Next, pitch refers to the highness or lowness of your voice. This differs from volume in that pitch has to deal with tone and how far your voice travels. For example, you can have a low volume but a high pitch. It is also connected to your inflections, which happen when you change the pitch of your voice to convey meaning in your message. Moving on, we also have your rate, otherwise known as your tempo. This refers to the speed at which you speak and is connected to the rhythm of your speaking, also known as your pattern. There are also pauses, which are momentary breaks in your speaking. These can be on purpose or by accident. Oftentimes we can use pauses for dramatic effect, but sometimes pauses can be due to our nervousness. Many times, people have a habit of filling in pauses with what we call disfluencies or vocal fillers. For example, you perhaps know many of these and probably use many of them yourself. They are disfluencies such as ya, like, and so on. We also have vocal variety. This refers to the change of pitch, rate, and volume which gives a voice a specific style or expression. These are often known as dialects or accents. For example, in the United States we generally have 4 vocal varieties, or dialects. We have a general dialect, often associated with the West Coast. There is also a New England dialect, often connected to those on the East Coast. We also have a Southern dialect associated with those from the South. And we had a Midwestern dialect which is connected to those in the Midwest. Next, we have pronunciation, which refers to the accepted standard of sound and rhythm for the words in our culture. While articulation refers to the physical production of particular speech sounds, vowels, and consonants. And lastly, we have your vocal quality, which refers to the overall texture and timbre of your voice. For example, some people have a warm voice, or perhaps a very clear voice, while others may have what we refer to as a scratchy or rough voice. Moving on to our next category, we have proxemics. This is communication through space and distance. There are 4 generally accepted forms of proxemic communication. First, there is intimate space, which refers to 0 to 18 inches between people. We tend to use this distance for intimate or close relationships. Second, we have personal space, which is 18 inches to 4 feet. In this distance we often decrease forms of intimacy and usually reserve this distance for family or friends. Third is social distance, which refers to 4 feet to 12 feet. This distance is often used with acquaintances or people we may be familiar with. And lastly, there is public distance, which is 12 feet to 25 feet, often used in our public interactions. Our next category is known as olfactics. This refers to communication through smell or scent. Different scents may communicate different things, and we can use smells as a way to attract, cover, or repel. In our culture we often spend much of our time controlling scent, as we tend to abhor repellent smells. For example, if you were to look in your house you would notice that practically all your products have added scent to them. Your deodorant, shampoo, lotion, toothpaste, detergent, cologne, perfume, even your foods have added scent to them. It is a major part of our culture to control scent, and we often make an effort to cover up organic smells. Artifacts serve as another category for nonverbal communication. These refer to adornment and articles we use in our appearance. For example, we choose certain clothing styles, colors, designs that tend to fit how we perceive ourselves. It also entails jewelry, glasses, headgear, hairstyles, and so on. Most people use artifacts to nonverbally communicate who they are or how they keep themselves. Our last category of nonverbal communication is known as chronemics. This is the use of time to communicate. Chronemics is divided into 2 main subjects, monochronic and polychronic. Monochronic refers to perceiving time as structured, task-oriented, and linear. Cultures and people who perceive time in this sense tend to take time seriously, using it to achieve tasks, not wasting time, and being very objective. Polychronic, on the other hand, is perceiving time as more fluid, less rigid, focused on multitasking and not as structured. In our culture, for example, we tend to use chronemics in a monochronic way, that is, we are very structured and value our time. I am sure many of you have heard the old saying in our culture, time is money. This would be a perfect way to sum up our culture's view on time. Now that we have covered the basic functions and categories of nonverbal communication, let us move on to our final point on 2 basic ways to begin improving your nonverbal skills. The first practice to begin is what we call developing a nonverbal mindset. This means becoming more aware of your own nonverbal cues and the role they play in your communication process. You must get into the mindset that your nonverbal cues actually affect the way you come across to others, so it is important to analyze yourself and understand what exactly your nonverbal cues are. To give a brief example, I will use a situation from my own life. A friend approached me one day after we had a meeting with some friends and informed me that when I speak to them it often comes across as condescending and pompous. He pointed out that when I speak to people, I often cross my arms and bring them up to my chest, giving the impression that I am speaking down to them. This caught me off guard because not only was it not my intention to come across that way, I had no idea my practice with my body language was to cross my arms across my chest when speaking. Once I was made aware of this, I corrected my body language and became more aware of how my body language came across to my friends, believing that my nonverbals were important and impactful. The second practice to begin improving your nonverbal communication is known as nonverbal immediacy. This is the practice of physically and psychologically practicing your nonverbal cues to become better at using them. For example, once you have begun developing a nonverbal mindset, you want to begin making the effort to improve those skills. You begin by physically being more oriented towards others. Practice respectful eye contact, work on your gestures, and practice with your voice. For example, while I was in college, I had a great group communication professor whom I learned some great communication skills from. One of the best exercises she had us practice was to read out loud every day for approximately 10 to 20 minutes. This was meant to begin disciplining ourselves not only on our vocalics, but also on how to speak up and interact with others in group settings. This exercise changed my expressive style and affected the way I give speeches and lectures. And it is an exercise I practice to this day, over 10 years after that class ended. So that brings us to the close of your lecture over nonverbal communication. Remember, your nonverbal communication carries 6 main functions, and 7 main categories. The goal is to understand how each of those categories plays a role in our communication and presentation, making it our goal to improve those skills by observing our weaknesses and homing in on our strengths.